Chinese people often tell Europeans that many of the ideological differences between the two sides pale in comparison to the differences each of us has with the United States. There is absolutely no need, especially at a time when both of us are engaged in a strategic game with the United States, to expose our contradictions in front of the US, lest the US pick us off one by one. As we all know, China and the EU have recently reached so-called agreements with the US to delay the trade wars. China reached an agreement with the US on May 12th, postponing or suspending it for 90 days. The EU, just a few days ago, or, to be precise, Trump announced that the imposition of a staggering 50% tariff on the EU has been postponed until July 9th. In other words, recently, to varying degrees and for different durations, both China and the EU are in a lull period of the tariff war with the US. Consequently, whether and how the two sides should strengthen communication and coordination have become matters of great concern. The US is the world's leading power, while China is the second largest. China and Europe are also important trading partners for each other, and both have intricate and complex trade relations with the US. Of course, there are also many differences and even conflicts between China and Europe, but in such a situation, the commonalities should, without doubt, outweigh the differences. Coordination between the two sides is beneficial to both in terms of strategy. This is a fundamental strategic thinking. Recently, there is news, first announced by the European side, while the Chinese side has not officially confirmed it yet, that a WTO World Trade Organization meeting of commerce ministers will be held in Paris in early June. During this meeting, the Chinese Minister of Commerce and the EU's Trade and Economic Security Commissioner, equivalent to the EU's Commerce Minister, will meet on the sidelines in Paris. At first glance, this may seem like an unremarkable piece of news, but in fact, its significance cannot be overstated. As I mentioned earlier, at the very least, in terms of strategy, if not in terms of grand strategy, it is necessary to strengthen coordination. Of course, it would be best if there could be coordination at the strategic level, but the difficulties should not be underestimated, nor should the importance. First, let's talk about the importance. Undoubtedly, if China and the EU fight the US separately, it is definitely not as effective as if China and Europe join forces against the US. Of course, this sounds idealistic. It is impossible in theory and even more so in practice. However, the two sides should at least strengthen some coordination in strategy, so that the strategic signals the US receives from both China and Europe are not contradictory, and so that the US cannot pick off China and the EU one by one. As we all know, Trump and his team are actually quite professional in dealing with trade matters. That's why we often say that Trump is a transactional person, and so is his team. They are experts in making deals, but not necessarily in formulating grand strategies. In terms of grand strategies, both China and the EU, given our rich cultural heritages and profound strategic thinking, are in a better position. Of course, as I said earlier, there are significant contradictions and conflicts between China and the EU. However, no matter how great these contradictions and conflicts are, they are not as significant as those we face with a common opponent. Moreover, there are no fundamental structural and strategic conflicts between China and the EU. What do I mean by this? There are structural and strategic contradictions and conflicts between the US and China. The US is the current leading power, and China is rising rapidly. At least in the eyes of the US, China objectively has the potential to challenge its position. Therefore, the US regards China as a thorn in its side. This has little to do with ideology directly, but combined with ideological contradictions and conflicts, the situation becomes even more complex. However, there is no such problem between China and the EU. The EU is no longer the world's leading power, and its ambition is no longer to become the world's leading power. So, there is no issue of one replacing the other between China and the EU. Of course, there are differences in ideology, values, and issues such as electric vehicles and new energy between China and Europe, as well as the so-called overcapacity problem. That's why the EU often imposes anti-dumping measures on China. Europeans can be a bit inflexible and rigid at times, and they tend to be stubborn in ideological matters. But we often tell Europeans that many of our ideological differences, including those on industrial policies, overcapacity, dumping, and other such issues pale in comparison to the differences each of us has with the United States. Moreover, these differences are overshadowed by a fundamental truth. There are no structural or strategic conflicts between China and the EU. This is a critical distinction. Strategically, if we can internalize this principle, it could open new pathways for cooperation, not just tactical coordination, but potentially strategic alignment. Of course, some disagreements may remain intractable for now. We can set those aside for future discussion, even if debates grow heated. But the key point is this: when both sides are engaged in a strategic rivalry with the US, there is no need to air our differences in public and risk being divided and conquered by America. In that sense, the upcoming meeting in early June between China's and the EU's trade leaders, let's call them commerce chiefs for simplicity, on the sidelines of the WTO Ministerial Conference in Paris, carries significant strategic weight. While some EU officials have confirmed the meeting, the EU's official spokesperson and the Chinese government have not yet done so. Still, I believe it's worth highlighting this development in advance, as we'll need to monitor progress over the next week or so. Personally, I may offer some strategic insights, even if not professional in the academic sense, to shed light on potential coordination opportunities. Now, let's shift to a lighter note about the EU. French President Emmanuel Macron is currently visiting Vietnam. On Sunday, upon his arrival in Hanoi, a video began circulating on social media and international news outlets. The footage shows Macron disembarking from his plane on a red carpet, accompanied by his wife, Brigitte Macron, his former high school teacher, who is significantly older than him. In the video, she playfully slaps his face twice with both hands, causing him to recoil slightly in mock defense. He quickly composes himself with an awkward smile and offers his arm as they descend the stairs, but she ignores it, even brushing it off. The two then walk down the steps side by side but separately. Most viewers interpreted this as a sign of marital tension, joking that Macron might be henpecked at home. While we won't delve into the gossip, the video is authentic. As both a private citizen and the French president, even his personal moments carry public significance. Yesterday, Macron himself addressed the incident, stating, "The video is real, but you're overreacting. We were just joking around." Joking around in this way, only someone out of touch might believe that. Clearly, there's more to the story, but let's not overstate it. After all, even heads of state are entitled to privacy. France has a history of presidents navigating public and private lives. Think Nicolas Sarkozy's divorces or François Hollande's midnight scooter rides to see his partner. It's almost a cliché: no romance, no Frenchman. But when such drama plays out on the world stage, it can verge on embarrassment, as it did for Macron this time. Let's hope his remaining 2 years in office won't be overshadowed by personal matters. That said, this is just a bit of trivia entirely unrelated to the strategic China-EU dialogue we discussed earlier, but worth sharing for some light-hearted context. Thank you for your attention.